Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang, and the Good Faith Podcast is a production of Redeeming Babel. And it's where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. And dominating the attention of our world right now, of course, is the presidential election, which means so much of the world's attention is focused on two political figures, two politicians, Harris and Trump, maybe with some extra attention that leaks over to Waltz and Vance. But it's a remarkable sort of focus and concentrated attention we are having on a very small number of politicians. And it made me start thinking, is that the way we ought to think? Or ought we, especially as Christians, be broadening our attention to other politicians that may not be getting as much attention in this season, but nevertheless may still be important? And I had just the right guest to help us explore this topic, which is our founding friend, David French. David, welcome back to the Good Faith Podcast.
Thanks, Curtis. It's always great to be here.
And we're here actually in person. We are actually physically looking at one another across the desk. We're here at Belmont University, where David and Russell Moore, our friend, and myself have just done some speaking on campus about our project, The After Party. So we're already thinking about politics and politicians. So David, I want to ask you the question, what's the rationale for broadening our attention to other political figures, even in this moment, beyond the obvious top two, top four?
Yeah, I think the reason is a lot of people actually are very concerned about the future, not just this moment.
Yeah.
And they do wonder, is there any reason for sort of any hope in American politics? And so, I think it's a neat idea to sort of say, wait a minute, let's step back and say, who are the people who are doing some good work? Or who are some people who have demonstrated some real courage? And do they exist? And if so, the other question is, do they have a future?
Yeah.
So do they exist? Yes. Do they have a future? Maybe.
We're going to have to talk about that. Yeah. Right. And so I think especially in connecting this with the after party, we talk about one of our core two attributes that should mark the Christian approach to politics. One is humility, so we don't know the future, but the second is hope. And I think you're right, David, to cultivate hope, we ought to be looking really long-term, that God's little seeds of hope may be found in places that aren't obvious or aren't at least getting all the media attention. And that's why I thought, you know what, let's do an exploration of this. And I wanted to do this in the form of a draft because David and I are both participating in a fantasy baseball league. And David, the champion for this year is a guy named Andy Andres.
Yes.
And
who's the 7-time champion of our
It's something
league?
really obnoxious. But the reason he wins is because he drafts sleepers.
Yeah.
And by a sleeper, I mean somebody who is off the screen from everybody else, that only kind of he is watching. They're usually somebody young, somebody up and coming, and then he just picks them at the right spot that they're going to actually be on an upward inflection. I think that's the kind of person we're looking for. We're looking for sleeper politicians who they may or may not themselves be Christians, but as Christians, we should be paying attention to them because they may have some spark of hope to them, which we as Christians are called to have. So we're going to do this in a draft format. And David, you as the guest, I'm going to give you the first round draft pick. We're going to then alternate between a draft of sleeper politicians that Christians should be paying attention to. Go ahead. The clock is ticking.
Yeah.
You're on the clock. Who is the number one round draft pick for you?
Yeah, so I don't know how much mine are sleepers necessarily. I think one of them is.
Okay.
But I do think that there are people that, if you're not a political junkie, they might be. But I'm going to start with, I have three people. They're going to be in the category of the prodigal, the future, and the exile.
Oh, that's a lovely.
And I'm going to start with the prodigal.
Okay.
And the prodigal is Senator James Lankford, former Baptist youth minister from Oklahoma. A really, just a good, to my knowledge and my experience, a really good dude. Why would I say prodigal? Because this is a guy who spent a lot of his time during the Trump era really, honestly, pretty loyal to Trump.
Yeah.
I mean, not loyal to voting not to certify the election loyal. There were only 6 senators who did that. But a person who had spent a lot of time, not much policy daylight, certainly between him and Trump. And even though Senator Lankford is known as a gentleman, as somebody who's just a person that people really like and respect, was not somebody who would have been considered a conservative dissenter during Trump's term. But then something really interesting happened. He took it on himself to try to negotiate across the aisle with Democrats on a border bill to try to solve the immigration crisis. And he reached an agreement. Actually, he was quite an effective negotiator. It was probably the toughest border bill I've seen, period, in my adult lifetime. I don't think there's really much question that it was the toughest border bill that I've seen. Negotiated with Democrats. The Senate was ready to vote on it. Initially, it appeared the House was ready to vote on it. This is something that would have been very, very important for sort of the common good of America, because it's not that it sealed the border, shut it off to immigrants, but it did really help fix some of the most broken elements of our immigration system, namely our incredibly inefficient asylum system. So it's a really good bill. And then Trump just torpedoes it. He literally just does not want to give Joe Biden a win on the border before the election. I mean, that's the sum total of the explanation. And an interesting thing happened, though, Curtis. Normally, when somebody is smacked by Donald Trump, they kind of slink off into the corner, or they slink out of the party, not slink, or maybe leave the party. But a lot of times, if a Republican is smacked by Donald Trump, they kind of get in the fetal position, right? Or they stand up, but they're out. And what Lankford did is really interesting. He got smacked by Donald Trump, and he stood up, but not out. In other words, he didn't walk out, but he stood up. And he's been telling the story very forthrightly about what happened, and that this was politics. I mean, that this, and so he did something that's kind of unicornish in Republican politics, which is take an incredibly important issue, try to work towards a common good-oriented compromise solution, and then when Trump comes against the compromise and the common good, won't back away from the rightness of his position. And so, maybe prodigal's too strong, because like he wasn't like sleeping with the pigs or anything. But there's a definite arc that really suggests, wait, okay, you can't be wandering out in this Trump, and you can't be out there in this Trump world. At some point, you're going to have to make a choice between, am I going to tell the truth and do what's right, or I'm going to fall in line? And he decided on this really, really, really important issue to do what's right. And then after Trump smacked it down, he told the truth. So that's my first draft pick. That's a good draft pick because it hits on a lot of themes that I think are going to run through this conversation. One theme it hits is I like that term, the prodigal, because our long-term future of our country is going to have some kind of return back to one another. And if we immediately write off anybody who has sided with Trump or, chosen a direction that we would not have chosen for ourselves, we're never going to come back together. We're going to have to figure out some way to return these so-called prodigal sons and daughters on this. And that's a great example. But it shouldn't be just a blanket all is forgotten, forgiven, whenever that day comes, if it ever comes, David. But there has to be some reckoning or some sign that there was, like the prodigal, a come to their senses and turn to home, which is the key sort of move of the prodigal. And I love that this is somebody who came to their senses, at least on this reality that this issue was being scuttled solely for political reasons, and was willing to stand up to Trump. And that's a great attribute, one in short supply, one we should celebrate, and one that gives me a little hope. So, I mean, think about this. We're weeks from an election where everyone in the Republican world, or not everyone, but almost everyone in the Republican world is saying it's existential. America will die if Donald Trump doesn't win. And Senator Lankford has been on Fox News in the last few days saying, I negotiated this bill and Trump killed it for political purposes, period, end of discussion. That is what happened. And so, going on Fox of all places, he did a big interview with the New York Times, and he did this, but that's in the New York Times. He went on Fox and said the same thing. And so I think that there is, this is the type of situation where we really have to say, just as you were saying, look, it's not that I'm sort of whitewashing everything that went before, but when somebody does stand up on an issue that's important and then stands up for the principle and doesn't back down when smacked in the face by Trump. I mean, can't interpret that any other way than signs of hope.
Yes, and we need courage and hope, I think, in this moment are so closely related in that what we're so desperately needing to feed our hope is signs of courage among our politicians. And then I think really to tackle and expose what happened on immigration, which clearly is a wedge issue that is being used, is being weaponized in this election, to actually stand up to Trump on that and say, hey, we had a solution, you scuttled it. That's a meaningful amount of courage. So I like that pick. Okay, so that was the prodigal. Remind me of the other two categories you had, just the categories.
The future and the exile.
Prodigal, the future, and the exile.
Yeah, the future will be my next one.
I'm scrambling because to match David's poetic skill here, I'm going to call mine two the governor and the warrior. Okay, those are my two choices. And so I'm going to start with the governor. That's my round 2 selection. And he is a literal governor. This is Spencer Cox, governor of Utah. I don't know him at all, hardly. I met him in person earlier this year, and I was thoroughly impressed. He is somebody who just sort of reeks competence. He actually has done a really credible job in governing Utah, in passing some key legislation. But the other thing that I really appreciate about him is he has prioritized the need to get to a healthier politics if we are going to have a competent governance. So he has led the way in trying to depolarize our politics at the state level. In Utah, before his last gubernatorial election, he appeared in a ad with his opponent, his Democratic opponent, where both of them were sitting side by side, looking in the camera, and basically advocating for civility and for a acceptance of the results, which is a really important message in this day. And it's sad to say that those two things, civility and acceptance of results, make you a heroic figure right now before a Republican, especially to do that like Cox did, was really encouraging. And I find him smart. He's thoughtful. He's a Mormon. And David, in rebuilding this country, you can say what you want about what you think theologically, how you categorize Mormons, but let me just say politically, as Christians, we need the Mormons. We need the Mormons to stand and hold the center with us. And so somebody like him is really encouraging. What's also, I think, interesting about him is that he was known as somebody who stood up to Trump, or at least refused to sort of kiss the ring early. So he very publicly said that he did not vote for Trump as a Republican in 2016 and 2020. What's interesting is he's kind of in some ways the opposite trajectory of Langford.
Yeah.
Right. So he's somebody who early on kind of stood up to Trump, and then most recently disappointed a lot of folks by signaling, I'm going to vote for Trump in this upcoming election. And a lot of folks read like, oh, another sellout. Mm-hmm. And there's a way in which, like David, like in drafting athletes and around, like no athlete is perfect, right? They all have some of their flaws. Like in a scouting report, they're not strong in everything. And I suppose I could interpret like, oh, I wish he had stuck to his guns, in terms of his convictions, and not signal support for Trump. But I'm going to turn that flaw into a feature and say, we're going to, like to your point of the prodigal, we're going to need to figure out a way to actually work together, come back to people who have made different political choices, including electoral choices that we may disagree with, but still have an underlying character and made it for their own reasons that kind of could be understandable. And I don't know all the reasons that he articulated, but I've met him and I've seen his track record enough to say, okay, I'm gonna view him as somebody who I think in the future we can come back together on common ground, even though we can credibly say we voted differently on various elections. I think that's an important kind of future scenario that we need to hold out hope for, that we're going to be able to have those kinds of partnerships with people who voted differently than we would have.
Well, our first 2 draft picks are Trump voters.
That's right.
Yeah. So Langford has said he was going to endorse Trump after the primaries. He stayed out of the primaries. Yeah. And then once Trump won the primaries, he endorsed Trump. But, this goes to back, a few weeks ago, I decided, at least through the election, to get back on Twitter. And I tweeted out something that said, good people will vote for Harris, good people will vote for Trump, and good people will vote for third party.
Right.
And this is, I think, an example of that. I don't agree with their decision.
Yeah.
Just full stop. But if we're going to move forward, you know what we're going to need? We're going to need people. Some of those good folks who voted for Trump.
Yeah.
And I love the Disagree Better initiative that Governor Cox implemented. I spoke at one of his Disagree Better events here in Nashville with Governor Bill Lee, who's another governor who I think is very different from the sort of the MAGA ethos, my governor in Tennessee. And so, we're going to need Trump voters. It's not like you can say to 47% of America, hang out over there in the corner, guys. The 53% are going to fix this thing for you.
Right.
No. That is not the way it's going to work. But I do want to give a shout out. I was just in Utah, and I just spoke to just a wonderful gathering of BYU students. BYU hospitality is unmatched, I'll say. And I had the chance to meet Deidre Henderson, the lieutenant governor, and she is very impressive. And she has not gone the way that Governor Cox has gone. She has said, no, I'm not going to vote for Trump, even though I'm conservative. And part of it is because she also runs elections in Utah and has seen some of the consequences very up close of the conspiracy theories. But I'm glad we started with two Trump voters. Two Trump voters.
And David, I want you to give me one quick riff on the point I made about why Christians really should be paying attention to Mormons right now, because your past working with Mitt Romney, building evangelical support for Mitt Romney, make that case for why long term this is an important alliance.
I can make that case easily.
Yeah.
So one of the interesting things is a lot of Christians seem to feel like if we don't run the place, we can't prosper here.
Yeah.
If we don't run America, we can't thrive in America. That really is kind of that binary. Are we going to rule? Are we going to be oppressed?
Yeah.
And the Mormon, LDS folks have never had the ability to run America.
No.
Right?
Yeah.
Always been a small minority.
Yeah.
They're so much of a minority and had faced so much persecution that there was an extermination order.
Yeah.
The governor of Missouri issued an extermination order against members of the LDS Church in the 19th century. I mean, you're talking about
people who have actually faced extermination orders.
Faced persecution.
Yeah.
And so they've never sort of been able to had this idea that they could rule America.
Yeah.
But they've done so well here.
Yeah.
They've thrived here. They prosper here. And it really does show that in this big pluralistic country, if we preserve our pluralistic institutions, this idea that we need to run the place or we face darkness is just a false choice.
Yeah.
That's a false binary.
One other thing that I think I really appreciate about Mormons, which is related to my title for Cox, which is the governor, which he's literally a governor, but he also has governed well in Utah, is Mormons are really good actually at governance. They're like, if you look at like the business schools and business thought leaders, like they're populated with Mormons. And my theory on that is because the Mormon ecclesiology is all laity. It's like they don't have a professional class of people to run their churches. They run their churches and ministries all through their lay leadership. And so you're just I think you're cultivated as a Mormon. Like I need to grow up to learn to responsibly govern and run things. And David, we're going to need that. Like we need more than we need like any partisan victory. We need like competence. We need governance. We need people who are looking out for the greater good. And I think the Mormons bring a kind of ethos of good governance, I'm making stereotypes here, of course, but generally speaking, I think Mormon institutions are really well run. And I think we're going to need that kind of ethos and skill. Okay, so we've had our first two rounds. The clock is ticking now on round 3, David. Who's your third pick?
My third pick is the guy I'm going to categorize as the future,
Okay.
and this is Democratic Governor Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania. Now, you're going to sense a theme in all three of my picks. I'm reaching a point where it's hard for me to really respect a politician unless I've seen them stand up to the extremes in their own movement. Or if I've seen them... Or it's hard for me to respect a politician until I see them as heterodox in some way, because unless they're heterodox, unless they've shown an ability to withstand some of the extremes of their own movement, I just don't trust them.
Well, because in this moment, that is the battle, is to
Yes.
actually stand up to the extreme. So if you can't do that, you're not fit for the moment that we need.
Right,
now.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Right has to stand up against far right, left has to stand up against far left, or center left, however you want to label these things. And then also, I just like competence.
Like our theme of confidence.
Competence, integrity. So here's a guy who has had a number of heterodox political positions. Yeah. Somebody who, for example, initially had proposed school choice, in Pennsylvania, had supported school choice in Pennsylvania. Definitely heterodox for most Democrats. Somebody who had stood up to the some of the anti-Semitic protests after October 7th. Somebody who's very openly and proudly a Jewish American and really, put some skin in the game to withstand some of the far left anti-Semitic protests, and also just flat out pretty darn competent. Yeah. Where he, there was, what was it, the I-90 bridge or I-95 bridge in central Philadelphia that was destroyed in a freak accident, and I spent some time living in Philly, and I thought, this is going to be a nightmare for a long time. And by golly, they got this whole thing fixed in weeks. Yeah. Just in weeks. And then there's this other thing that really impressed me about him, Curtis, and that was when the assassination attempt occurred in Pennsylvania and a Trump supporter was killed. And when Josh Shapiro spoke about that in that moment, he really rose to the occasion. Yeah. Because here's a guy who's a hyper-partisan, right behind Trump on the stage, right. Super partisan MAGA supporter, gunned down. And here's the Democratic governor who had genuine emotion in paying tribute to this fallen member of his community, even though they probably couldn't be more opposite politically. Right. And I know listeners might go, well, yeah, that's just human decency. Yeah. But
we'll take human decency right now.
We'll take it. I mean, gosh, we'll take it. And so, yeah, in my assessment, when I say the future, this is somebody who his star has only risen. Yeah. And it's risen in interesting ways, in part because he's been heterodox, because he's zigged towards compassion when some people have zagged towards just mindless partisanship. Yeah. So that's my second pick.
Well, that's the third round, your second pick. I want you to say a little bit more about him because he was, talked about as a running mate for Harris. And, what is your assessment? Because since we're doing this, it's kind of an exercise of feeding hope. What is your assessment of the possibility of figures like Shapiro rising to greater national prominence? Because he almost made it onto the ticket, right? So that should give us some signal of hope. What are the kind of the parameters for folks who, like you've described, are willing to stand up to the extremes of their own party? What kind of prospects and obstacles do they face?
Yeah, so the obstacles are obvious because anytime you stand up to the extremes, you're standing up to actually and usually the most active vocal people. Right. So you're going to feel disproportionately hated because they're so loud. Yeah. And it makes you feel it can make you feel as if the world is against you when maybe actually the world is for you. Yeah. And this extremist minority is against you, but they dominate the public square. So I think what you see is you're going to have people who are clear-eyed enough to know that when the extremists come after you, they're speaking for a minority. They're not speaking for a majority. Yeah. And the other thing that I think is really interesting is that Shapiro is of a piece with sort of something that I'm seeing happening in really in the center left, which is there are two simultaneous moves happening. One is away from extremism. Yeah. So, for example, Kamala Harris's positions are different in 2024 than they were in 2019 and 2020 when extremism was really rising on the left. So it's away from extremism and also moving away from a relentlessly angry public presentation. And so this is, again, something that has been degrading our culture. Trump has a relentlessly angry public presentation, and it's helping turn all of us into this, balls of anger and rage. Yeah. Whereas we're beginning to see a move away from that. Yeah. Interestingly, we saw that for 99% of the vice presidential debate, which was very interesting. But so I am seeing, particularly on the center left, a move away from relentless anger. There's been a lot of conversation about joy in the Kamala Harris campaign, and a move away from extremism. Yeah. And if we can execute both those moves, one party is great. If you can get there on two parties, nature will heal.
Well, what about structural reasons why these kinds of sleeper politicians that we're talking about may face extra struggle? Because one of the reasons it seems to me why it's so difficult to fight against the extremes is just structurally the primary system pushes both parties to the extremes, and you've got to kind of deal with your flank on the extremes in such a way just to even make it to the general election. Is there any hope on that front?
Not much.
Yeah. Great.
Okay, not much. Gerrymandering is pretty cemented right now, and that's a big, big problem.
Yeah.
I do think there are some interesting initiatives around ranked choice voting that can help break that. But so long as we have both the big sort compounded by gerrymandering, this is where you're going to look at a politician like Langford and a politician like Cox and say, wait, okay, they're also zagging, in a pretty important way because they're from basically one-party states, Oklahoma and Utah. Yeah. And even though they're from these one-party states, they have presented a very different vision. Now, Shapiro is in the platonic form of the swing state.
Right.
Like, Pennsylvania has it all. I love James Carville. It's Philadelphia and Pittsburgh with Alabama in between. and so, in an interesting way, that can cut either way with him because on the one hand you say, well, it's the swing state, so he's got to tack to the middle. Yeah. On the other hand, you say, well, it's a swing state, so he can't lose anybody on his left flank. Yeah. And so it is not as simple as to say, well, he's a swing state, he's got to be more moderate. Yeah. We have a swing country. Right. And, Donald Trump is not more moderate, in part because, there are two different theories. If you're just mercenary about it all, there's sort of two different theories about political success. One is the mobilization theory. My base is bigger than your base. I'm just going to whip them up to a frenzy and bring them out. The other one's the persuasion theory, that I can't just win with my base. I need to pull in a few other people. And so I think Shapiro has doubled down on the persuasion theory over the mobilization theory, and that's what we kind of need.
All right, we were talking with David French on this election season about how all the energy in the national media gets sucked towards two political figures, Harris, Trump. And yet, if we're going to play the long game, we may want to look deeper into the ranks of politicians for signs of hope and also signs of youth, signs of maybe another generation emerging. And so we've been doing these draft picks, and at least, how old is Langford?
Langford is 56 years old.
Okay, Langford is 56 years old. Cox, I believe, is 49. And so it's interesting that these are younger.
This is Gen X, Gen X festival.
Well, David, say a little bit about that. Say a little bit about the generational shift. I mean, certainly Harris represents something of finally a move from, to
young
elder.
Boomer. Young boomer. Yeah. She's a young boomer.
She's a young boomer.
We've been having old boomers. She's a young boomer. I honestly, if you had asked me 3 months ago, if we shift to Gen X, are we going to do better? Yeah. And I would have said, yeah, absolutely. I like my generation. I'm old Gen X. I'm not so sure anymore. There's some interesting data that is showing that in some ways Gen X has sort of been most shredded politically and polarized politically in this moment, especially Gen X parents. So, it turns out that it's the Gen X and older millennials who've been flooding the school board meetings and everything because it's our generation that has the school-age kids, college and high school, et cetera. And so I don't actually know anymore, Curtis. I used to sort of have this kind of naive sense that, dang it, once we get these boomers, and I'm not being ageist, that we have had a way too old political class. I just think that's an absolute truth, and that you have a younger, more energetic generation. And I'm just not so sure. I do think there are generational distinctions for sure. Yeah. Obvious. It's you see it in the voting data. You see it in a lot of the other kinds of data that register how we approach the world. There are generational differences, but I don't feel like I'm past the point of saying that we have generational panaceas.
Yeah. Well, it seems like what we're looking for is character traits that cross generations. It's not like one generation owns courage or one generation owns virtue or competence and so forth. Okay, so we've been doing this sort of in draft order. Just to review, David took as his first round draft pick Langford, who is the prodigal. I took in round 2 Cox as the governor, literally the governor, and then David went with the future with Shapiro. I'm going to go in my round pick with the warrior, and that person is Adam Kinzinger, who used to be a House Representative from Illinois, my home state of Illinois, and he was a warrior. He was a warrior in the sense of he served in the armed forces, in the Air Force, and then became a congressman, multiple terms in Congress, and is a paradigm, I think, of somebody who showed courage in the moment of great distress on January 6th, and all of what happened in the aftermath. One of the 10 representatives who actually voted for impeachment, served on the congressional committee to investigate the incident, and has been a stalwart champion. And he's a Christian, has spoken openly about his faith and about growing up as kind of in a fundamentalist background and coming to a more healthier vision of faith. Spoke at the Democratic National Convention as a Republican, calling on other Republicans to support Kamala Harris. And so those are all brave actions of a warrior, of somebody. And he has continued. So he lost or he chose not to run for re-election. And I think this gets to some of the dynamics that we've been talking about what are the barriers against these sleeper politicians of character and courage, is that they face an uphill battle. So in his case, because of redistricting, his district got redrawn by Democrats in Illinois into very unfavorable terms that almost made it very difficult, almost impossible for him to win. So that's why he chose not to run for re-election. So that's an example of, I think, that we need these people. We need thoughtful, brave, courageous conservatives, and yet they face an uphill climb. Not only from within their own party, David, but really in some ways Democrats are making it harder for these folks to actually be part of the political landscape and the solution. So Kinzinger has spoken very strongly about this move that happened in the last election cycle, where Democratic PACs poured money to support MAGA candidates so that they would face a sort of a more favorable, the Democrats could face a more favorable election opponent. And I don't think Kinzinger was subject to that, but he's spoken about that. And we know other politicians, Peter Meyer got defeated in his primary to a large extent because of Democratic funding of his MAGA opponent. So this is something that's just a cynical political ploy in my mind on the Democrats' part, that they are making things worse by actually preventing the people you actually need. And it's such a short-sighted view of politics as just win one more little chip versus seeing that the health of our whole political ecosystem requires a thoughtful, courageous, rational, sane, conservative movement. That Democrats, even if you disagree with the philosophy or the policies of somebody like a Kinzinger, which I actually do. I don't agree with him on all of his policies. He doesn't take climate change as seriously as I do. But I feel like he absolutely needs to be a person in our political landscape. We need people to represent even the divergent viewpoints, but represented in a way that is healthy, courageous, conscious, with conscience. And so he's a figure who is now no longer in electoral politics, but he is still a political figure, commentator on CNN, obviously, like I said, spoke at the DNC and at the convention, and has started his own PAC to try to recover the sanity and the conscience and the core values of the Republican Party. Still calls himself a Republican, but is fighting desperately to reclaim the soul. So we need warriors like that who are not going to just kind of walk away from the fight for the soul of the conservative movement and the Republican Party. He's fighting the good fight.
Yeah. No, he really is. He really is. And being redistricted out of his seat, gosh, in the did I not just mention gerrymandering?
Yes, you just did.
Redistricted out.
Yeah.
And I'm completely with you. When in 2022, when the Democrats were funding ads designed to bolster some of the most hyper MAGA people, I was like, to borrow my dispatch colleague Jonah Goldberg's memorable phrase, I was like a toddler banging my spoon on the high chair, saying, "No, stop this," because I remember when Democrats laughed when Trump won the primary in 2016. Ha, ha, ha. Look, you chose an unelectable person.
Yeah.
And here we are. And so, Yeah, it worked for the Democrats in 2022. All of the MAGA candidates they boosted lost.
Yeah.
But you're just playing with fire here, guys. You're absolutely playing with fire. Now, there is an interesting thing, though, that is also happening. I'm glad you mentioned, that he was the warrior, that he was Air Force, former Air Force. There's this interesting phenomenon where a lot of these very, for lack of a better term, what you might call very alpha ex-military folks are...
Sort of like you, David.
Oh, totally. Yeah. Exactly. Like a William McRaven or a Mark Kelly or a General Hurtland. There's a lot of these folks who have been gravitating towards the Democratic Party in part because, number one, they don't see the Republicans as serious on national security as they get more isolationist, but also they find this culture of the masculinity culture of MAGA as repugnant. And if you have spent much time in military circles, the kind of bravado masculinity of MAGA, it exists in the military. I'm not going to say it doesn't, absolutely, but it is not the dominant culture. Bravado and self-promotion, not the dominant culture, at least when I was serving. The people who were the most respected were the people who didn't talk about all of the great things that they did. I remember one of the first times my son met a Special Forces soldier, and this is sort of before the killing of Osama bin Laden and before sort of the explosion of like Navy SEAL self-help books and all of that.
And workout plans. Let's
and
not
workout
forget the
plans and all of this was, the whole culture of special ops was we don't talk about it. We let our deeds do the talking. And so there's this whole culture, military culture, of a masculine military culture that is, no, you live with honor and courage. And courage includes moral courage. And so there's I think there's no coincidence that you've had a William McRaven who was on Kamala Harris's short list. William McRaven was the guy who headed up Operation Neptune Spear, which was the operation to kill Osama bin Laden. You've had a lot of these, some of the most significant and important military leaders either explicitly call out Donald Trump or explicitly call out Donald Trump and also say, I'm going to be a Democrat or vote Democratic. And so I do think that there's an interesting hint of a realignment there.
That's so interesting, David, because we talk a lot on this podcast about how institutions shape us, shape our character, and form who we are as people, and form our character. And it strikes me that the military really institutionally is constituted actually not to, and it's when it's operating well, operating not to promote bravado and self-promotion, because that gets people killed in war. All right, if a general or a leader is actually acting out of a thin bravado to promote self-glory, it's the enlisted men who are going to suffer for that. So institutionally, there's some guardrails that form against that kind of promotion. The other thing that it strikes me that the military promotes, and I want you to talk a little about this, is one that we've talked about: competence. Competence really matters. People die if you are incompetent, and there's severe consequences, right? So I'm wondering if we need to be looking in some ways as we think about hope and future, how much do we really need to be thinking, man, we got to we're putting a lot of hopes on our military, both to remain the way they are for their own tasks, but also to be producing people so that their graduates are formed with that kind of low bravado, low ego, high honor, high competence. We need institutions who are pumping those kinds of people out to be leaders, not just in our political realm, but in all of our institutions.
Well, the most important, and I think in some ways misunderstood address of the Trump era was General Mattis talking very briefly to group of soldiers, and this was, I believe he was in the Middle East, and he basically said to this small group of soldiers, and these remarks were reported widely, and he said, look, there's something sick in our culture right now. I'm paraphrasing, that neighbor is turning against neighbor, we're dividing, it's getting dark, and he basically said, you need to hold the line, soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. And a lot of this was interpreted as, while we're divided, you're holding the line, defending against foreign aggression. I think there's two meanings.
That's right.
That's absolutely correct, that they're defending against foreign aggression. But he's also saying, be the model. Be the model. Because I was speaking the other day to a group of folks in higher ed, and I said, look, the military has the diversity that the higher education world longs for.
Yeah, that's true.
The military has not just all of the ethnic diversity that the higher education strives to achieve, but it also has all of the socioeconomic diversity that higher education totally lacks.
Yeah.
So you're talking about socioeconomic diversity, ethnic diversity, political diversity, religious diversity. I mean, the military really is this melting pot, and that's what I felt like Mattis was saying.
Yeah.
Show the way.
Yeah.
This is how we do it. This is how we show. And in addition to, of course, guarding America against foreign military threats, but it's in many ways it's one of the top 2 or 3 most important cultural institutions in the United States.
That's right. We've gone through 4 politicians already: Langford, Cox, Shapiro, Kinzinger, and we're here for the 5th and final pick. David, who is it?
Yeah, it's former Representative, sadly, Mike Gallagher, who had spent some time as, this rising Republican star from Wisconsin. A guy who got into politics for, the same reason people go to the Bachelor reality show, for all the right reasons.
Okay.
So
I'm eager to hear that connection.
He was in politics because he wanted to fix stuff.
Yeah.
He's a national security expert. He is somebody who, trust me on this, there are not many politicians that you can talk to and have intelligent deep dives on policy. This guy, you could go as deep as you wanted to go on foreign policy, national defense, China. It's like imagine you have a politician and the head of a think tank department at the same time, right? This is the kind of guy, sort of the scholar, warrior politician. Also, he's a Marine who served 2 combat tours in Iraq. So this
fits our profile.
The Renaissance man, the scholar, the warrior, the politician, and he's out. He's gone. Why is he gone? He now works for a national defense firm called Palantir. And so why did he leave? And I'll just read the beginning couple of paragraphs of a Washington Post profile. The story turns on a gruesome moment the night of December 30th, 2023, in Gallagher's hometown of Green Bay. The local sheriff had received an anonymous call claiming that Gallagher had been shot in the face and that his wife and 2 young daughters, 3 and 1, had been taken hostage.
My goodness.
A SWAT team arrived at the house to find Gallagher and his family safe. His anguished wife, Anne, somehow had the presence of mind to ask the SWAT team to take their shoes off before they searched the home. But for the young couple trying to build a family in the town where they were born and raised, the cruel hoax was a deeply upsetting event. For Gallagher, it proved to be a breaking point. In Congress, he'd gotten used to death threats and actual attacks on his colleagues, but this involved his wife and children. I signed up for this, but my family didn't. So that's why I call him the exile.
Yeah.
So this is a guy who was literally chased out of politics by violence, threats, intimidation. And there are a number of people who fit this profile. There's a number of people. And the way I look at it is, I do not in any way, shape, or form condemn this guy for stepping aside in these circumstances. We just had an event where we talked about what is the role of, our public profile and the opposition that we get, and how does it impact our spouses?
Yeah.
And one of the things I said in that was, unless you are both totally unified on how you're going to approach this, you're going to need to, in many times, you're going to need to defer to the concerns of your spouse.
Right. It's got to be a family mission.
It has to be a family mission. And it's very hard to say, you know what, family, including 3-year-old and 1-year-old, here we go.
Yeah.
That's a heavy, heavy lift. So I look at it as this is a time of, for lack of a better term, exile. We're on the front edge of a Cold War with China that could be more complex in some ways and more dangerous than the Cold War with the Soviet Union, in part because China, unlike the Soviet Union, is an economic juggernaut.
Yeah.
When we were facing down the Soviet Union, we were the economic juggernaut. They were the military juggernaut.
Yeah.
And over time...
And the technology gap is far thinner.
We were the technology juggernaut. Yeah. We were the economic juggernaut. And so we had a material edge. We had a qualitative edge. With China, it's all up in the air.
Yeah.
They're technological juggernaut. They're an economic juggernaut. They're building their military massively. They have, really a rich culture that the Soviet Union drained so much of the richness of Russian culture. But, China has this rich culture. It's a powerful country. It is powerful. And Gallagher was the guy in Congress forward thinking on these issues. And now he's out. And why were people so angry at him? He wouldn't vote to impeach Secretary Mayorkas, for example. He broke with MAGA on a number of initiatives, even though, again, he was a Republican who voted with Trump the vast majority of the time. But not enough. You have to be all in, or to MAGA, you're all out. And so I feel like here's a guy who's waiting in the wings, Curtis.
Yeah.
He's exiled.
Yeah.
But is exactly the kind of person we're going to need to call in from the bullpen after this moment has passed.
David, I want to talk more about that term, the exile, because I think a lot of folks feel that way, that they are no longer have a home, which is the definition of exile. They no longer have an institutional home, a cultural home. So this is not a isolated experience. And I think it's really telling that you picked somebody who you labeled as the exile. What does it mean to provide leadership? Let's just talk about leadership more broadly, even expand it out from just the political leadership. Because the exiles need leadership. They need their figures as well.
Yeah.
What does it mean to cultivate in ourselves, to look for and support other people, leaders that we need in exile?
That's a great question. So one thing that I think it is very important for you personally, when you see somebody who mirrors your journey, let's say you feel homeless, you feel exiled, to reach out to them and say, I'm one of you, I'm with you. Yeah. I know that's very, very encouraging for me, as much hatred as, you see on social media. When someone just sends a short email and says, I appreciate what you're doing, I feel like I'm right there with you. Yeah. You have no idea how life-giving that can be, because people are just absolutely besieged. The other thing that I would say is have grace for the different way people handle this. So, for example, I'm exiled to the point where I don't think I'm ever going to be welcome back in the GOP. I mean, there's just no way. So everyone's like, oh, you think you're going to have a seat at the table if Trump loses and you're not. No, I do not think that at all. But, and so a lot of people will say I'm Mike Gallagher, why aren't you as outspoken as David? He's minding his business, doing his work right now for Palantir. Not everybody has to be outspoken all the time. Yeah. He's taken his lumps. He's been through the ringer. Now he's going out. He's providing for his family. Doesn't have to say stuff all the time. Yeah. Doesn't have to weigh into everything. And if and when the time comes that he wants to move back into this, then, he would have much more of an opportunity than I would have. Yeah. And I there's that phrase, it's sort of wise as a serpent, harmless as a dove. Yeah. Why can't we respect different people's visions of what it looks like to be wise in the moment? That's right. Well, I do think that's right, that we have different ways of living out our exile, but we still do need to find each other and support each other to know that we are not alone. One of the hardest things about the exile experience is the feeling like you're alone. Absolutely. This is why we do this podcast, why I end this podcast with the metaphor of the campfire, because it is this image that culturally, politically, socially, in so many ways, theologically, even, that many people feel homeless. They feel like in exile. And their version of exile is that I'm wandering through a wilderness, lost and alone. And I hope our podcast, our work in the after party, David's writing, is like little campfires, which is what I mean by people who are in exile, wandering through the wilderness, can find each other, can find other exiles, share stories, share insights, share wisdom, and especially share companionship, such that we're not alone. And for the next part of our journey, and we don't know what the next part of the journey, that's part of the challenge of the exile, is you don't know how this is going to end up. You don't know, are you ever going to have a home? And so you have to nourish this hope that actually there is a home for us, if not in the next election cycle or the next generation, certainly in the age to come when Jesus returns to make a home for all of us. And that's the vision that, especially as Christians, we need to keep alive.
And we need to, as well, keep alive kind of our attention to signs of hope, like some of these politicians that we're talking about. So, David, I want to give you the final word, especially as we are heading into into the election itself. We're going to have other podcasts as the election draws near with David, and then after the election with Russell to help us all process this. This is not their final word on the both pre or even post-election, but start preparing us as the countdown is beginning. David, how do we keep our own hope alive, even when it seems really bleak?
Yeah,
and that
there's a couple of petty things and maybe some bigger things. So here's one petty thing.
Yeah.
Pay no attention to the polar coaster. So,
say what the polar coaster is.
The polar coaster is when in a very close election that is within the margin of error, as the polling indicates. So the margin of error in a decent poll, 3 to 4 points, right? So you're going to have a series of polls that are going to have your favorite candidate up by 2, followed 3 days later by a series of polls that have them down by 1 or down by 2. Yeah. And then the next day it's up by 3, and the next day it's down by 1. And you're going, what is happening? And the answer is nothing is happening.
Right.
This is what margin of error political races look like.
Yeah.
So the polar coaster is a real thing. Don't get on the polar coaster.
I love that term. Actually, that's the first time I ever heard that term.
Oh, that's the first time?
Yeah.
That's an old pundit term.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, that's an old pundit
Okay, that's
term.
one. That does not, frankly, that does not seem trivial to me. That seems like a discipline and practice that many of us really should be adopting.
Oh, I have to remind myself of that all the time.
Yeah.
But you get one that your candidate is up 2 and you're like, oh, momentum. And they're down by 1 and darn, what happened?
Momentum crushed.
No, it's just the polar coaster.
Yeah.
It's the polls are saying, when you understand margin of error, the same thing essentially.
Yeah.
That's why you have to look at big averages and things like this to really have any understanding. So that's number one. And then number 2 is also understand the underlying strength of our system.
Mm.
So I'm one of the things that I'm thinking about writing before the election is, okay, so what happens? What is the realistic crisis that we would face if Trump wins? Like what are the tools that would still exist to limit his freedom of action, et cetera? Yeah. And there's a ton. There's just a ton. And so, our system is not perfect, no question about it. But one thing that our system is built to do from the ground up is to prevent tyranny. For you to achieve tyranny in the system, you have to break through so many significant guardrails. Now, of course it's possible.
Yeah, and it is happening.
Of course it's happened.
Yeah.
January 6th, you broke through a bunch.
Yeah.
But the bottom line is an enormous number of institutional barriers still remain. Yeah. And so, someone was saying, do you really think that Donald Trump would destroy our democracy? And I said, let me put it this way. I'm 99.5% sure that America can persevere even through a really awful 4 years of Trump. But the thing that's significant about that is every other presidential election of my lifetime, I'm 100% sure that we're going to be okay. This is the first one where I think there's an actual scenario I can see where things get super dark and bleak. But at the same time, we do have a lot of these institutional restraints that so many other nations lack. But the final and the most important thing is you just can't read the New Testament and think that we're supposed to be a people of despair in the United States in 2024 when Jesus and the apostles were creating a people of hope under Roman rule, in like AD, the early ADs. And so here's a people of hope and faith being born in a time of oppression that we can't imagine.
That's right.
And so we have a much lesser challenge and we're much less hopeful. Yeah. That ain't right.
Yeah. David, amen to that. Let us, all of ourselves, encourage one another when we gather around our various campfires to the true hope, not a hope of any savior politician to arise from the sleeperdom ranks, nor do we think our ultimate hope is on some sort of institutional integrity of the American government. As much as those things are sort of provisional, small indicators, they're not our ultimate hope. As you said, David, we are called to the eternal kingdom with our King, who will come and return and restore all things. There's nothing that this election can do that will not be restored and repaired in the end by our King. And that is our true hope. So, David, thank you so much for today coming back to remind us of that and close out our draft with that final message. All right, and listeners, next week we will once again gather around that campfire where we can encourage one another on this journey. Thank you so much, and God bless.